Welcome back. You're watching Credlin. Well, as well as stopping construction of the Mexico border wall, cancelling the Keystone Pipeline and ending the travel ban on some Muslim-majority countries, President Joe Biden last week signed a far-reaching executive order that hasn't been quite given the attention it deserves. The executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation has enormous consequences for young female athletes in American schools. Now, any American school that receives federal funding must allow biological boys who self-identify as girls onto girls' sports teams or face administrative action from the Federal Education Department. Joining me now to discuss this from Hobart is Liberal Senator Claire Chandler, and from Sydney, columnist with the Australian newspaper, Nick Cater. Senator Chandler, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on the show. I know this is an issue you have been very passionate about. You've spoken out about it in the Parliament, and you're not sort of backing down. Obviously, this order in the US is cloaked with language diversity, inclusivity and all of these things, but in practical terms, it will make huge changes, won't it, to women's sport?
Absolutely, Peter. I mean, the executive order that you have said was administered by President Biden on day one of his administration is effectively instructing agencies to force schools to allow biological males to compete against females. And this should be incredibly concerning for every fair-minded Australian, because it's exactly what we've seen starting to happen in our own country, where you have peak bodies like Sport Australia, like our peak sporting organisations doing exactly the same thing, developing guidelines which encourage the inclusion of men who identify as women in women's sports to the exclusion, in many cases, of women. And it's simply not fair and it's not safe. And to be perfectly honest, I mean, we knew that this was going to be happening with the Biden administration. We knew that this was part of his policy platform, but I was frankly shocked to see it happen on day one.
Nick Cater, you've written about similar issues in your column in The Australian yesterday. You spoke particularly about the experience of Martina Navratilova.
Yeah, well, there's some irony in this, Peter. Martina Navratilova, as you remember, this time last year was protesting about Margaret Court and said that the Margaret Court Stadium should be renamed because of Margaret Court's hurtful views on transgenderism and homosexuality. And yet Martina Navratilova now has come out and expressed her enormous concern about the idea that biologically male people who've transitioned should be competing against women. You know, as Claire has pointed out, it increases the danger in some sports quite considerably, but it just changes the whole thing. I mean, and this comes, of course, this whole movement comes from the gender studies and queer studies departments of universities, where they believe there is no biological difference is just a social construct. You know, there's no such thing. Everything is a social construct. And yet, well, it's quite an odd idea to you and I, because we know that there is a very real difference. And if you put a man against a woman on, say, the rugby field or even the tennis court, you'll see that difference.
We've fought as women, Claire Chandler, for such a long time for there to be a decent pay for women's sport, access to a range of sports. I mean, I grew up when there was no such thing as women's rugby, women's AFL. Now there is. There seems to be no barriers to women. And just at the time that I feel there's some sort of, pardon the pun, level playing field, you now have the case under the law in Victoria, as someone over the age of 16 can change their birth certificate with nothing more than self-identification. A boy can call himself a girl, and it's open slather with the netball team, it's open slather with women's sport. I think that's it's a backward move, and you've got to wonder where the feminists are.
It's pretty catastrophic, Peter. I mean, I've spoken to sportswomen who, you know, commenced their careers, you know, in the middle of last century, talking about how they weren't allowed to run over a certain number of metres on the athletics field because it was determined that women couldn't run that far, or having to wait for the blokes to play their game while the women waited around and provided them with their tea and sandwiches after the game before the women were allowed to get on the sporting field and compete themselves. So I think, as you've said, there are significant consequences if we don't try and achieve a sensible balance here. And I think the sensible balance is starting from the point that women's sports should be for biological women, and there's every reason that should remain to be the case.
Nick, yesterday in your column, you wrote about the conversion practices legislation in Victoria. It's in the Parliament, it has not been passed. You call it a Trojan horse for activism of the most insidious kind and an attack on parental rights. Tell us why.
Well, what this bill will do will make it illegal, punishable in some cases by up to 10 years in prison, for you to counsel somebody that they shouldn't change to the gender that they say they are. Because what's happened in the last 5 years is there's been this growth in what they call affirmation therapy, where if somebody comes to you and says, well, I'm a girl but I feel like I'm a boy, the only thing you're supposed to say is, well, of course you're a boy. You cannot argue against, because it's supposed to cause irreparable damage to that person. So as you said, it is self-affirmation. There's no other condition that I know of, either a physical condition or a psychiatric condition, where the same thing applies. A doctor would normally apply his judgment. But what's worse in this bill is it will apply to priests and counsellors, it'll apply to parents. And in the case of priests, it specifies that one of the illegal acts will be a prayer-like activity, whether it's consensual or not, i.e. if a troubled 15-year-old comes to you as a priest and wants to talk about this, and you as a priest, drawing from your convictions, say, well, I think you should say as the gender that God intended you to be, that will be a punishable criminal act. And whatever else this bill does, that is the big warning sign that it should not pass and should be opposed when it comes before the upper house in Victoria in a few weeks.
It's extraordinary, Senator Chandler. I can't buy a glass of wine if I'm under the age of 18 in Victoria.
No.
But if these laws go ahead, I could change my gender overnight. I could go forward with, treatment that can't be reversed. I could have a mastectomy. Everything could happen to me, and there's no one able to give me an alternate view. Senator Chandler, what do you make of these laws?
Well, I think Nick's categorisation of this bill as a Trojan horse is an incredibly accurate one. And as Nick pointed out, there are serious concerns about the impact that this bill in Victoria will have on free speech and our ability to have an open discussion about the appropriateness of some of these treatments. I find it frankly baffling that at the same time that we have the Kirabel case in the UK that has described some of these treatments for gender dysphoria in children as experimental at best, we have an Australian government, the Victorian government, attempting to outlaw having these debates in the first place. It is deeply troubling for free speech.
Well, Senator Claire Chandler, I know you will keep speaking about these issues. I know they're not easy issues to speak about, but they're critically important. And Nick Cater, more strength to your arm and your pen as you write about them. Thank you for your time.